The New York City Commission on Human Rights does not provide legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of the Commission. Enjoy the show.
Hello, New York. Welcome to another episode of Rights Here, Right Now. I am your host, Jose Rios Lua, Chief of Staff at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Rights Here, Right Now airs on the last Monday of every month on WHCR 90.3 FM. Each episode will give listeners the info they'll need to live, work, and thrive free from discrimination in our city. All of our episodes are also posted on the Commission's website, YouTube, and Spotify. November is Native American Heritage Month, so we're going to start the show by reading out the agency's land acknowledgement. The New York City Commission on Human Rights acknowledges the land politically designated as New York City to be the homeland of the Lenape, or Lenape-Hoking, who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. The Lenape are a diasporic people that remain closely connected with this land and are its rightful stewards. We also recognize that New York City has one of the largest urban Native American and indigenous populations in the United States. The Commission acknowledges its role in not centering Native American and indigenous voices in our work in the past, and as a result, has not appropriately addressed the needs of the communities and their experiences with discrimination. This dynamic exists within the broader context of ruptured relationships between Native American and indigenous communities and municipal governments, resulting from centuries of state-sanctioned genocide. The Commission is committed to forging a new trajectory for our agency by building sustainable relationships with Lenape and other Native American and indigenous peoples. We are actively engaging Native American and indigenous leaders as equal partners in collaboration, fostering a space that prioritizes their voice to direct our service in ways that best serve citizens of these nations and members of these communities. Before we dive into the show's topics, here's a little background information about our agency. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is the city agency that protects New Yorkers from discrimination in employment, housing, and public spaces. The Commission is charged with enforcing the city's human rights law, one of the broadest civil rights laws in the nation. The law prohibits discrimination against over 25 protected categories such as race, age, gender identity, immigration status, and nation of origin. New Yorkers can report discrimination to the Commission by calling 212-416-0197 or by visiting our website, nyc.gov/humanrights. The Commission also seeks to prevent discrimination by conducting outreach to educate New Yorkers on their rights and responsibilities under the law. The Commission provides training and workshops that detail the protections enshrined in the law. Our trainings are grounded in the idea that our rights are interconnected and that we all have a role to play to advance equity in New York City. You can request a training on our website. Again, that's nyc.gov/humanrights. And I'm joined once again today by the Commission's Deputy Commissioner of Policy and External Affairs, JoAnn Kamuf. JoAnn, welcome back.
Hi.
JoAnn, we recently had the privilege of going to Gracie Mansion for the second annual Native American Heritage Month reception, and it was an amazing event. Don't you agree?
It was fantastic. I would say a few things stood out as compared to some of the other times I've been at Gracie Mansion. There was dancing and drumming. There was amazing food, and there was really a wealth of tribal leaders who were there to both recognize some of the historic wrongs that have happened, but also, to your point and to the point of the land acknowledgement, to think about pathways forward where there's more collaboration and recognition.
Our agency has been very proud of the work of bringing underrepresented voices into conversations. That event is just one example of how we do that work. I'm going to move us on. Today we have a guest, Molly Schaeffer. Molly has served as the director of the Office of Asylum Seeker Operations, also known as OASO, and she's been in that role since May of 2023. Prior to this position, she served in multiple roles in City Hall, including as a deputy chief of staff and senior emergency advisor to 2 mayors. A native New Yorker, Molly brings more than a decade of experience in emergency management, public safety, and health and human services. She has been involved in the migrant emergency since it began, leading the city's humanitarian effort that have supported more than 223,000 migrants in just under 2 years. As a director, she's responsible for the day-to-day operations of OASO, coordinating the city's response with over 20 city agencies, New York State, and federal partners. In addition, she's responsible for advising the city on emerging migrant issues and working with multiple agencies to maximize response and formulate practical policy solutions for a wide array of complex issues. Molly, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
So, Molly, before we jump into the work of what is OWASO, what's the work that you are doing, JoAnn and I like to start by asking every guest one simple question. What is your favorite thing to do in New York?
I really love ice skating. I live near Prospect Park now, so when it starts getting a little cold, I get really excited because that means I can actually go ice skating near my house, but there's also Bryant Park. There's ice skating for free, and then there's like a lot of other random ice skating places around the city, but Bryant Park is great because then you can also go to the shopping area right behind it because it's always at the same time.
I will see you while you're ice skating, and I am having hot chocolate since ice skating is not my favorite, but drinking hot chocolate is my favorite.
But to the point of ice skating, I think everyone thinks of, wintertime and ice skating as like a Rockefeller Center thing. And there's just so many spaces citywide, like around the city, to be able to do that with friends. So we're going to jump right into it. We're going to talk about some of the work behind OWASO, and I'm going to turn it over to JoAnn to start us off.
We just wanted to start off by asking you, what is the mission and vision of the Office of Asylum Seeker Operations?
We manage and coordinate the city's response to the influx of asylum seekers arriving in New York City. We've always tried to center their arrival and our response with dignity for our clients, for the folks coming in. So our vision is that the city provides a welcoming place for asylum seekers to shelter and get the supports they need temporarily that then graduate them on their journey towards self-sufficiency. We really try to focus on all the ways that we can support people and get them integrated into the bigger society.
As we know, as government entities, there's the mission you were created to do, and then there's the evolution of how things work once an office is put in place and the rubber hits the road in terms of operationalizing. So would love to hear from you specifically what inspired the creation of OWASO and how has it evolved?
So this really arose as first an emergency response office. We were starting to get a massive influx of individuals, and we couldn't open shelters fast enough. We have DHS, which is the Department of Homeless Services, which is our traditional homeless serving entity, but they couldn't place people fast enough. They couldn't open shelters fast enough. There was just so many people coming that needed really complex support that we needed a different type of entity to be able to work across agencies that were supporting migrants, as well as with our state and federal partners, because it became clear very early on that this was not a New York City-focused response. This was a national humanitarian response that we were managing on the city level, and so we needed a different entity than our traditional sheltering entity because this wasn't just a sheltering response.
And I think you've kind of alluded to the array of services that go into making the experience as welcoming as it can be. So I'm curious, how do you coordinate across agencies and ensure that services are accessible?
So we have regular touch points with all the agencies. So we have now 3 times a week, we have basically a stand-up with all of the key sheltering agencies. We have issue-specific meetings. We're constantly trying to build systems where everyone's talking to each other so that we coordinate them talking, and so they know to come to us with any issues and we can help them resolve. A lot of that comes from incident command structures in the emergency management world and just making sure that everybody knows who are the right people to go to help connect the dots. Because there are more than 20 city agencies working on this, everything from making sure kids are getting connected to school as quickly as they can get here, but also making sure they also have the vaccines that they need to go to school when they don't have health insurance, making sure that their parents apply for health insurance because that is free in New York City, despite anyone's background, making sure if there's any trauma that people have had through their journey, and there often is, that we're connecting people to mental health. There's just a lot of complex needs for this population, so we really are always coordinating across so many different city agencies.
And thank you for playing the coordinating role, which can be really complicated with the amount of services already in place for New Yorkers and then what it means to have an influx of people that were not potentially anticipated. And I'm curious, but before we move on to some other kind of achievement and impact questions, if you can just tell us a little bit about who are the asylum seekers, where are they coming from, and what does it actually mean to be called an asylum seeker?
People tend to lump this population, and they're really diverse. We have more than 160 countries in our shelter system right now. The majority of the population is from Venezuela, and that was really what started this influx. But then we also have a lot of folks from Ecuador, a lot of folks from West Africa, a lot of folks from Mauritania, Senegal, and then we have people from Russia, we have people from China, we really have people from all over the globe. About 78% of the individuals who've come into our care are families with children. And most of them come from the border, so they're going to the border, maybe they're staying in another place for a little while, and then they're coming into our shelter system and asking to stay. But there is more and more, there's been a secondary migration. So there's been a lot of folks who really settled in other cities. So folks who settled in Denver, Chicago, Miami, couldn't get the kind of support that they wanted or needed, and then made their way to New York City. And we're seeing that more and more too, that it's not just the inflow from the border, it's also this secondary migration. But one thing that I think is really important for folks to know is that we've nearly tripled our shelter system, the city shelter system, in less than 2 years, which I think is a point that is not really thought about. But we currently have about 58,000 asylum seekers currently in care. That number is on top of our traditional homeless shelter system, which is the biggest in the nation. And so we've nearly tripled that sheltered population in less than 2 years.
In November of 2024, we are not in the same place we were in March of 2023, right? That expansion of the shelter system is one of those ways that we show that we're not in the same place. What strides has the city made recently to support migrants and asylum seekers?
So I think there's been a lot of strides. Before January of this year, the sheltered population, the asylum sheltered population kept going up and up and up. Every week it went up. And then in January, it started going down slightly, but it started going down, the amount of people that were sheltered every day. And that was due to a lot of focused work on what can we do to expand services for this population to help them identify barriers to leave shelter and continue on with wherever they want to settle. So what we did in summer of last year is we started an asylum application help center to help connect people to the kind of legal support they need. And we've filed about 90,000 federal immigration applications, which means that all of those folks are one step closer to both getting work authorization if they haven't already, or at least being on a pathway for legal citizenship. We connected people through the small business services, through their Workforce One centers. We helped connect people to open jobs who had work authorization. We've also helped connect people to jobs and housing in other cities. So we've worked with the state on a migrant relocation assistance program to help people get 1 year of housing upstate. And we've been able to move, I think it's about 600 families that way. And finally, we've also been able to identify new types of programming that, again, helps this specific population, which isn't eligible for a lot of the benefits that other populations are because of their status, to the kinds of supports they need to move on. So our Department of Homeless Services colleagues were able to identify through case management families who needed just a little of cash to move out. Like they had apartments identified, they had jobs, they just didn't have any savings to move on, and we're able to help them with first and last month of rent, some furniture, so that they could move into their own apartments. And so we've really coordinated across all of these agencies to develop a litany of the types of services to help break those barriers so people can move on.
Something you said actually just brought a thought into my mind that I don't know that your team gets enough recognition around, for lack of a better term, switchboarding work that you all have to do to support folks. But I think there is a misconception that new arrivals come to New York because New York was their plan all along. That's not always the case for everyone, right?
Right, and that's actually something we learned pretty early on, is that a lot of people took the free bus out of town. So Texas did this thing where the Texas government paid for busing. If you went to certain border cities and you said, I need shelter or I need support, I don't know where I'm going, the shelter providers would say, we have one night in this shelter, and then you've got to leave. So you can raise your own money to go to wherever you want to go, or we have this bus that's coming and it's free from the Texas state government, but it will go to either New York, Chicago, or Denver. So you have to pick between those cities. And so a lot of people took the free bus out of town and ended up in New York. And then when they get here, they would say, I don't actually want to be here. I actually want to be in Houston. Or I actually want to be in, like our second biggest place where we would reticket people or reconnect them was actually Texas. So people would take the free bus from Texas and then we would help buy a ticket back to Texas. We've always had this stat where 1 out of the 4 people who come to our arrival center, which is really our centralized place where people can be processed, will leave within 24 hours because we will reticket them or reconnect them to some other place in the nation. We've had 223,000 people come through our doors, and we're only currently sheltering 58,000, which means more than 70% have already gone. Some of that is like leaving our shelter after a couple days, some is leaving after a day. It just depends.
Well, with that in mind, are there any success stories or specific initiatives you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this a little bit, but I think the Arrival Center is something I'm incredibly proud of. In summer of last year, we had people coming all hours of the night on buses, planes, any way to get here, and being dropped off at random shelters or being dropped off at Department of Homeless Services intake centers, but there was no coordinated place. So we set up our Arrival Center, which each asylum seeker would go through. They get medical screening, they get behavioral screening, we check for infectious diseases, we check if they need any immediate things. We try to really stress and understand if there's any friends or family in other places we can help them connect to, because again, maybe New York City is not their final destination. And it's really our first chance to ask the kinds of questions that we need to start case management. So it's really our one-stop shop, our front door, and that's been a really exciting place because it also helps us connect people to medical care and insurance and get them on that sort of pathway. So Arrival Center is one. I mentioned before our Asylum Application Help Center, which has helped file almost 90,000 applications. Without that, there's so many people who would not even be on the pathway to work authorization, and this is something that the federal government came and saw and said was sort of world class, and we've gotten awards for it. I think our volume has been pretty impressive there. And then our case management practices, we had to really create an entirely new shelter system in very short order, and being able to also partner that with case management so that we can help figure out what people needed and then connect them to it has also been incredibly a success.
This work can't just be done well if it's just done by government. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the partnerships that OWASO has forged with local organizations or CBOs in order to meet the needs of migrants, including other city agencies as well. But I think my point here is just that, when we do this work, we don't do it alone as city government, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this really has been a whole of city response. We've seen mutual aid groups coming and helping out. We've seen nonprofits. The majority of our shelters are actually run by nonprofits, which I think is something that is not what the press will showcase, and we need their expertise. But I think we also listen and have many forums where we talk to both nonprofits and advocates. They've really helped inform some of the policy and help make some of the policy better. And part of the reason that so many people have work authorization today is a lot of the work of those mutual aid groups and a lot of the work of all of the nonprofits. There's been lots of really interesting groups that have come out in certain neighborhoods. So there's been an entire mutual aid group that rose up to help support the Floyd Bennett Field families. And we talked to them, and they have a WhatsApp channels with some of the families. They help provide books and clothing. And we've seen that time and time again throughout the city, especially near our bigger sites, groups of people who've sort of sprung up to really support these populations. I will also say that our faith-based partners have been really influential here.
Yeah.
You know, we work to create a faith-based program where we have up to 15 single adult men sleeping in a church. The faith-based community have done amazing things. So they've done back drives, they've supported individuals. There's, you know, mosques have really rose up to help support a lot of our West African guests. We've constantly both called in these groups into our shelters to help out. We've done resource fairs. Times we've had tensions, we've brought in some of our faith-based partners, but also the work they've been doing in community to integrate the people in our shelter system has been really great to see and be a part of.
How do you ensure the voices of the individuals who are being served by OWASU are included in some of the changes in policies and services and adjustments over time? I think you've already identified kind of there have been ebbs and flows in both the numbers of people, where people are coming from, and how do you endeavor to have that feedback loop with impacted people?
Yeah, I mean, I think I try to get out there into the community and talk to the people in our care a lot, but I also think we have lots of different ways that information is filtered out. We have lots of conversations with advocates and nonprofits that are working with people day to day, and sometimes the guests in our care do not want to talk to the shelter staff, but do want to talk to the nonprofits or advocates that are helping them. And so that information is constantly getting to us, as well as there's some focus groups in some of our sites and some of our bigger sites. That's something we've endeavored to create to make sure that those focus groups are filtering up information about how residents are feeling. And then we heard a lot in the press about concerns about food. And so some of our sites, a lot of our sites actually created surveys where residents can speak anonymously if they want about the food and what they want and what they want to see and what they're concerned about. And so we consistently try to have those touch points. And especially since we have such a diverse population from so many different countries speaking so many different languages, I think it's really important to create those spaces, because something that works for someone from Mauritania may not work for someone from Venezuela. And so we're constantly just sort of trying to figure out how to make both as happy as possible.
Being on the government side, I think one of the benefits of having so many agencies involved in being responsive is that this information, right, has a pathway back to us as those responsible for serving New Yorkers. Last question, then we're going to turn to looking forward. But, we've talked about some of the really amazing, I think, successes and the way that New York City has been nimble and flexible to meet the needs of new arrivals. I'm curious what you see as some of the challenges the city has faced managing the influx.
There's been numerous challenges. I think just the challenges inherent of having such a diverse population of people from so many different countries with their own cultures, with their own languages, with their own way of doing things, with their own education levels. It's, first and foremost, it's figuring out how to create a system that works for every single person, and, making sure we have enough quadruple lingual staff, especially in the fact that a lot of numerous amounts of folks in our shelter system speak languages that aren't super common. Wolof, Fulani, these are languages that are not super common in New York City. And so trying to figure out how we make sure that they understand what we're saying to them and that we have the right kind of translation services. That's number one. I think number two is the fact that so many people coming, having to create and find safe spaces for all of those people to live and having to do it so quickly is a challenge. Mm-hmm. Like it is a significant challenge. We've had to open, I think, more than 250 sites at this point, and that means we've had to review, go out, test for fire safety for more than 3,000 spaces. And we've had to get really creative. We've had to put people in school gyms, cruise terminals, tents, like places that you wouldn't necessarily think of as long-term sheltering sites, and which sometimes have huge amount of people. Our Randall's Island shelter has 3,000 people in it. That's not where we as a city want to be, but it's just what happens when, some weeks we had 4,000 people coming in each week, and we had to find some place to put them. So space was a big concern and has been a big issue overall. And then finally, with so many people coming, with so many sites opening, we very quickly overwhelmed nonprofits. We very quickly overwhelmed even some of these big conglomerate emergency companies, because nearly tripling a shelter system in 3 years is very, very, very difficult, and it's very hard to find that. We had numerous sites that for months at a time we had to just staff with National Guard because we couldn't get staff in fast enough. We couldn't contract fast enough. We couldn't find nonprofits who could staff up fast enough. So that's another significant challenge.
I think just for listeners who may be less familiar, New York is a right to shelter location. And so there is an obligation to provide the spaces that Molly's been talking about. And that is, I think, a reason many people landed here as part of their journey, whether or not it was the ultimate destination. The creation of OASO is part of living up to that obligation.
I wonder if there are any next steps or goals for OASO in supporting asylum seekers that you're looking forward to?
I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of all of this work we did this year on helping connect people to work, helping connect people to legal support, helping connect people to education. We got more people in childcare seats. So a lot of our connecting people to the resources they need work, like the outcomes of that, I'm really, really, really excited about.
I'm wondering how New Yorkers, just everyday New Yorkers, can get involved in supporting either the work of OASO or helping migrants directly.
If you have a shelter in your neighborhood, get with a bunch of your neighbors and set up an event that shelter residents can go to. So it's not always easy to have, random people go into shelters, but what can be helpful is having a clothing drive that you give to the shelter for them to pass out so that they can send people there. The other great space is just schools is helping. If you have kids in schools that also have migrants, is making opportunities to help those families feel welcome. I really do think if you have migrants, talking to them, hearing their stories, and trying to make them feel human and part of New York City.
This is also the time of year where we see clothing drives, toy drives, those types of things. And especially around the holidays and with the weather getting colder, there are needs. And so when I first started doing volunteering work, I learned that socks was a really big need. And that surprised me. And so I would have never known that had I not reached out to my local shelter. So that connection is super, super important.
We have a colleague who's talked before about some of the kind of fostering intergroup relations work that we do at CCHR. And there is not one person who does not have a sort of New York story. What is your connection to here? How did you arrive here? And for some people, it's joyous and it was planned. And for some people, it is not and it wasn't planned. And I think it is a way to really find commonality in a time when I think there's efforts to really identify differences. So how can you just build community at the super local level, I think is part of the work of all of us.
What lessons has the city learned that could serve as a model for other municipalities across the country?
First and foremost, it's this idea of having a centralized welcome place. So that for us was the arrival center, but the ability to set that up really helped us start to identify the needs of the individuals in our care and set them on case management and do all of the other things I mentioned around health screening. So I really do recommend for other cities having some sort of centralized welcome, whatever that looks like, and pairing that with screening and starting to get the kind of data that you need on people. The second piece is we really learned early on that we needed the legal support, so setting up our asylum application help centers to help people apply for TPS work authorization and asylum. That was pretty novel and really helped us move along in our response. The third piece, I think, is figuring out what kind of infrastructure you need to manage this. We started really doing this in earnest in August of 2022. That's when we announced the emergency executive order, but we set up our office in April. I do think that, hindsight is 2020, but if I was to do this again, we would have set up our office and our infrastructure for our office earlier so that we could hit the ground running. And it's really figuring out long-term, what are the kinds of supports. At some point, all of these types of responses normalize. So it's really figuring out early what are the supports that you're going to need in the places that normally manage these kinds of things. So in our case, DHS, what are the supports that they need long-term to get better at managing this type of population? And that is something that, I think other cities should think about too, because if you think about Chicago, if you talk to Denver, they're at a place where they've collapsed their migrant-specific shelter system back into their normal, traditional shelter system. And so I think that is something that we should always be thinking about what kind of support we can give people.
Molly, thank you so much for the work you're doing, for the work of your team. Thank you again for coming to the show and talking to us more about the work. Appreciate it.
And thanks for having me.
All right. So I wanted to share with our listeners that we will be hosting our second annual New York City Human Rights Summit, hosted by the New York City Commission on Human Rights. This gathering brings together policymakers, advocates, legal service providers, and community members from across sectors to address the challenges and opportunities in preventing and responding to discrimination in our city. In an era marked by uncertainty and rapid change, the importance of safeguarding civil rights cannot be overstated. Threats to equity, dignity, and justice require a unified response from all New Yorkers. And so we are excited to share that the summit will be held on January 9th, 2025 at 9:30. And if you want to learn more information about the summit, visit our website at nyc.gov/human rights.
I think just for folks who are wondering, what does the Human Rights Summit potentially look like? Last year we had training sessions, so on the human rights law itself. So there's an opportunity to learn more about your rights or potentially your obligations. There are also panel discussions with staff at our agency, so you can learn about what is our bystander training, what does it look like, how does a case get processed through the agency, and who are the people behind the email addresses you may have used. So I think it's super exciting, and I hope to see lots of folks there.
Yeah, looking forward to it. And like I said, we'll have more information on our website in the coming days. I think I'm really excited about this particular event because the summit's not just an event, it's a call to action. We're really hoping to have folks come together to identify strategies to uphold the principles of fairness and inclusion that define our city. So if you are passionate about equity in the city, I highly recommend that you register and attend the summit. JoAnn, we have a new-ish provision of our law going into effect on January 1st. And so we've been talking about fair chance housing. What is the New York City Fair Chance Housing Law? And what should folks know about it before January 1st?
So the New York City Fair Chance Housing Law is starting January 1st, 2025, part of the New York City Human Rights Law, and really increases and strengthens protections against discrimination in housing. The New York City Human Rights Law already prohibits discrimination based on criminal history in employment, but what the New York City Fair Chance Housing Law does is it brings some of those protections over to the housing space. I'm going to start with kind of some of the foundations of the law and then talk about what housing providers and applicants and current tenants and renters and buyers need to know about what their rights will be starting in January. So really, the New York City Fair Chance Housing Law aims to break down barriers to housing, just like many of the other protections in the city human rights law. What this law means is that renters and buyers cannot be treated differently simply because they may have a conviction in their past. For housing providers, that means you're going to treat all applicants based on their general housing eligibility, and that's really the foundation of a housing decision. The Fair Chance Housing Law puts in place a process that limits when, how, and what criminal history information housing providers can look at. We think this is really important and was passed by City Council over a year ago. That's why Jose said new-ish. The law has been passed, but the effective date is January 1st. So the law is really going to, I think, strengthen the ability of New Yorkers to obtain stable housing with the long-term goal of enhancing community safety for everyone and really tackling the stigma that has kept people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system out of housing. Let me tell you about some of the elements of the law.
Great.
Okay. The New York City Fair Chance Housing Law makes it illegal for most New York City housing providers to discriminate against renters or buyers because of arrests, pending cases. Most convictions that are in the past or other types of criminal history. It's not just about rentals, it's also about housing sales, and the law does apply to co-ops and condos. So there's a wide breadth of housing where there will be new protections against discrimination. It means that it will be a violation of the law for a housing provider to make statements about criminal background checks or conviction histories in ads, in applications, and in other communications. So that means we are removing what is often just a disincentive to people to apply for housing. If you see something that says no one with a criminal history will be accepted, that statement is now illegal, but it's also you're going to not have someone coming into the process thinking about, am I already being treated differently than other applicants? The law does not require housing providers to run criminal background checks.
That was going to be my next question.
So there are a few types of housing that are required by federal or state law to run background checks. Most market rate private landlords have no requirements to run criminal background checks, and that will remain the same. What the New York City Fair Chance housing law does is if there is a housing provider that chooses to run a background check, but they're not required to by law, it's going to require that they follow a whole bunch of steps to ensure, again, what I said at the beginning, they're looking at applicants based on their general housing eligibility. Housing providers are going to be required to make a conditional offer of housing in writing before they can look at any piece of a criminal record. So that means, say, Jose, you're applying for housing. You come, you fill out an application. There's questions about income eligibility, compliant with our source of income protections, of course. And there may be some questions about ability to comply with lease terms. Okay, you have the income verification. The next step in the process, if I, as a landlord, want to run a criminal background check, is I give you a written offer and I say, you have passed the initial application stage. Here's an offer of housing. We're going to hold a unit open for you. Okay, so if you don't want to run a criminal background check as a landlord, Jose can move in tomorrow. If I, as a landlord, choose to run a criminal background check, then there's a whole host of other steps that I'm going to have to follow. But what's, I think, exciting about this law is that it really highlights a whole host of categories that a housing provider or landlord is never going to be able to consider. They're just irrelevant to the question of whether someone is qualified as a tenant or buyer. So that's arrests, that's pending cases, that's any criminal legal system involvement that's been terminated in favor of an individual, that's adjournments and contemplation of dismissal, adjudications as youthful offenders or for juvenile delinquency, convictions that have been sealed or expunged or are under an executive pardon, as well as felony convictions that are from more than 5 years ago and misdemeanor convictions that are from more than 3 years ago. So that list of things I just discussed are off the table for housing providers. Those are things you can never ask about, and those are things you should never see or consider. The Fair Chance housing law does allow housing providers to look at a limited set of convictions. So these will be the only things that are ever fertile ground for a criminal background check.
This list is a lot easier to remember.
Yes. It's a list of 3. It's housing providers will be able to ask about and see sex offenses for which current registration is mandated, and that's regardless of when the alleged crime or the conviction occurred. The second category is felony convictions from the last 5 years. That means either the release date or the sentencing date were within the last 5 years. Anything that's older than that, housing providers can't look at. And the third category that housing providers can inquire about and look at is misdemeanor convictions within the last 3 years. So that means the release date or the sentencing date are in the last 3 years. Anything older than that is also off limits. So we're now at a situation where I have made a conditional offer to Jose. I have decided I'm going to run a background check. So I am able then to see the 3 types of convictions I just mentioned. What happens next? If after seeing those 3 things, I say, Jose, I still want you to live here. I can act upon the conditional offer of housing. Jose can move in today or tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm still not sure and I'm thinking about, wait, maybe these convictions cause me to pause on the application, there's another step I have to follow if I don't want to move forward with the offer of housing. It means that I have to let Jose know that he has a whole bunch of days to send information in support of his application, to say, I took classes to overcome some of the factors related to the conviction that you've seen. I have a personal reference from a community member. I have a professional reference from a job I've done, or other forms of explanatory or mitigating information. Jose's under no obligation to share that information with me, but he's welcome to over a period of about 5 business days. And then my obligation as a housing provider is to take everything Jose sent and look at that against what the convictions that I saw were, and to determine, do I have a legitimate, and that means non-discriminatory, business interest in either revoking the offer or not renewing a lease if Jose was a current tenant. If I think that I do have a legitimate business interest, I have to write that down, and I have to articulate what the link is between that interest and anything in Jose's information that he provided me or convictions. So there's a whole process, and really the idea is to allow applicants to understand what is the reason they are being denied housing, if that is the outcome. I think the other objective is to really cause a housing provider to think, is there an actual link between what I'm seeing in this wealth of information and a decision that I'm thinking about making to deny someone housing, and to make sure that that is provided with someone. Part of the reason this is super important is because there's a lot of assumptions, biases, and stigma related to criminal convictions. There's also a lot of inaccuracies in background checks. And so this process is also an opportunity for individuals to say, hey, that was not me that you did a criminal background check about. That's somebody else. Or that is me, but that is actually not my personal conviction history, or there's an error in that history. So we know that misinformation and incorrect information has been the basis for housing decisions, and this law is in place to prevent that moving forward.
JoAnn, thank you for that really brief overview. I know your team has been working on materials and explanations to share more resources with folks as we get closer to the implementation. I remember you saying in testimony and things that we know, criminal records are rarely a good predictor whether someone is going to be a good tenant. And that determination is being made before someone does a background check, if they choose to, because again, most people are not required to run a background check. So you're identifying a good tenant beforehand.
Yeah, and that's actually a quote of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. But what I would just want to say, and you can't talk about this law without mentioning it, it was really pushed forward by a wide array of advocates that were the Fair Chance Housing Coalition. And so New York would not have this exciting legislation if it wasn't for the advocates and for the city council putting this forward.
Well, folks, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for tuning in to Rights Here, Right Now. Remember that we all must work together to create a city where New Yorkers can live, work, and thrive free from discrimination. Until next time, stay warm, New York.